on modern buildings, they'll put a cornerstone somewhere and it'll have the name of the building and when it was erected, all those kinds of things. But in the sense, the way we use a cornerstone today is not in the sense of how they used a cornerstone in the New Testament. Back then, they didn't have computers, they didn't have technology in order to be able to ensure that the building was straight. So what they would do is they would have this perfectly cut square stone. And it was the very first thing that was laid as the building. And they would put that building perfectly in place, that rock perfectly in place, and make sure it was level on all sides. And then everything that was built off of that building could come off of that cornerstone. So if you pulled a line this way, you knew it would be perfectly level. And when you pulled a line this way, you knew it would be perfectly level. And if you pulled a line straight up, you knew it would be perfectly level. So the emphasis here, as we understand, is that Jesus Christ is established as the cornerstone of the church, and off of that cornerstone, the 12 apostles are laid out there as the foundation of the church. And we understand this when Peter speaks to this group. He's not just talking about them as individuals as if they were anything special. He's not saying that they were more important than anybody else, but what he's talking about is what he has given them that in order to establish them as the foundation of the church. Jesus Christ has given them this confession. He has given them this doctrine that enables them to lay the foundation of the church and establish them as that foundation. Because he's going to talk about this idea in verse 19 of this doctrine that he has given to them and how they are to use this power, use this authority that he has given to the apostles here immediately in the New Testament, which will be passed down from generation to generation through the church and through its leadership and through its followers. John MacArthur said the foundation of the church is the revelation of God given through his apostles, and the Lord of the church is the cornerstone of that foundation. So this confession that Peter has confessed is the doctrine upon which this foundation that the apostles had is built upon. So when Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, he's talking about you as the 12 apostles have this doctrine, have this faith, have this truth, have this confession, and upon that I'm going to build my church. Now it's interesting to look at what Jesus says there. So now we have this idea, the understanding of this truth, of this doctrine, but notice what Jesus says. He says, I will build my church. So we move from this sure and solid foundation on Christ to now looking at this chief cornerstone. He says, I will build my church. And I think this is important for us to remember because Jesus is saying this, so we're understanding that he's going to accomplish whatever he says he's going to do. And this idea is not that he's just starting to build his church, because we look throughout the Old Testament, God had established his people, had established truth throughout the Old Testament and longing for and looking for the Messiah. Hebrews tells us that the Old Testament saints were saved by looking forward to what Jesus was going to come and to accomplish. So it's this idea of to continue building. Because we're tempted to think in this world, and I speak mostly of, oftentimes of pastors, we're tempted to think like this, but I think even church members can think this way as well, that we think that we are the ones that build the church. That through our eloquent leadership or through our excellent decision-making or through our attempts to reach out to people in the community, that we're the ones that build the church. But brothers and sisters, we don't build the church. Christ builds his church. Now, he may use us to build his church, but we're not the one accomplishing that. That's the reason why you can see groups of people doing all kinds of things and a church may never grow, but it's only when God chooses to bless a congregation and chooses to work in the midst of it that that church will grow and do anything. You could have the greatest minds in the world. Now listen, I promise you, you go online. I used to say you could go to the Christian bookstore, but those don't exist anymore. So you go online and you look up the greatest church leadership books. There's no shortage of books that are going to tell you how to grow your church. But I promise you, you could read all of those books and you could put all of those principles into practice. And if God does not choose to bless that church is not going to grow. That church will not do anything more. It might attract people. It might grow a crowd. But as far as being a genuine church of faith, serving the Lord, that church is never going to grow. The encouraging thing also about this passage, he says, I will build it. But notice whose church he says it is. He says it's my church. This church doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Pastor Wes. It doesn't belong to Pastor Ben. It doesn't belong to any of us. This church belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ. I always shudder. I at times in my life and throughout the course of my life in ministry have been places and I've heard people stand up and make this statement, well, that will never happen in my church. Or this is my church. Not in the sense of just saying I have my membership there, but in the sense of them thinking that this is their church. And that's a dangerous mindset to have. That's a dangerous place to be because this church totally and completely belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ. The word church there means ecclesia. It's just a called out assembly. And we use that term when we reference it today. Oftentimes the term ecclesia just refers to the idea of a Christian church. But when Jesus was using this phrase, that's really all it meant was just a called out group of people. You would have used the word ecclesia to talk about a gathering of people in the town square or a gathering people out in the countryside. But it specifically means a called out people who are called for a specific purpose. So it perfectly applies to the church in a modern day because we are a people who have been called out of the world, called into a specific purpose, and that purpose is the proclamation of Jesus Christ and the gospel. So it's encouraging to look at this passage that says now that what we understand that what we are gathered here to do is that we are a people who have been called out by God for His purposes, for His plans. And because of what this confession of the apostles was given, this confession of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, this is what we are built upon. We're built upon a solid foundation of truth, a solid foundation of who Jesus is and what God had called Him to do. So we see the building, and here I want you to next notice the battle. Because this church is not without its difficulties in the sense of how we have to face the world. Notice what he says in the end of verse 18. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Now, the gates of Hades is the enemy identified. There's two things I want you to notice here in this passage, the enemy identified and the victory that is secured. This is another one of those passages that perhaps for many of us, we've grown